There are moments in life when you give everything you can to remain close to someone. Your presence, your energy, your patience, your willingness to understand, but none of it seems to matter. You show up with sincerity while the other person shows up with indifference. You offer clarity while they respond with confusion. You stay even when it hurts, hoping that one small sign of effort from them might make it worth it. But instead of acknowledgement, what you receive is silence, distance, or the unsettling feeling that you are far more invested than they ever intended to be. What makes this painful is not the lack of love, it's the lack of recognition. It's realizing that the version of you they see is not the version of you that truly exists. You know your heart. You know your loyalty. You know the weight of your presence. But they don't. And sometimes it isn't because you failed to show it. It's because people get used to what is constant. They grow comfortable with attention they didn't earn. They assume your presence is permanent simply because you made it easy for them. Human nature is strange like that. What is always available feels disposable, and what disappears becomes priceless. There is a quiet breaking point hidden inside this pattern, a point that doesn't arrive with anger or dramatic confrontation. It arrives in silence. One day, you simply understand that staying is costing you too much, that trying has turned into self-harm, that your peace is bleeding beneath the weight of trying to convince someone of your value. And it's in this moment, quiet, lonely, and strangely liberating, that you make a decision that changes everything. You disappear. Not to punish, not to manipulate, not to spark guilt, but to protect yourself. This decision is deeply aligned with Stoic wisdom. The Stoics understood the power of stepping back, of retreating when a situation steals your clarity and weakens your sense of self. They taught that peace is not found in external validation, but in the strength to walk away from what disturbs your soul. When you disappear, you are reclaiming your space. You are removing yourself from an emotional battlefield where you were the only one fighting. You are choosing dignity over desperation. The interesting thing about disappearing is that it creates contrast, something presence alone can't create. When you're always there, people don't feel your absence. When you're always available, they don't feel your worth. But when you step back, something shifts. The silence grows loud. The void you leave behind becomes undeniable. Suddenly, the person who brushed you aside starts noticing the empty spaces where your attention used to be. They notice the lack of your voice, the missing comfort, the absence of someone who used to care without being asked. Your disappearance exposes the truth. You mattered. More than they realized. More than they admitted. More than they were prepared to acknowledge. And while this realization dawns on them, another revelation rises within you, one far more important. You discover that the person you were becoming while staying was smaller than the person you become when you leave. You rediscover parts of yourself you neglected while trying to be enough for someone who never truly saw you. You begin to understand that your presence was a gift, not a burden. A privilege, not an obligation. And perhaps the most powerful truth of all, you didn't lose someone, they lost you. Disappearing is not running away. It is choosing peace when the situation refuses to offer it. It's recognizing that silence can be more honest than words, and distance more healing than explanations. When you walk away, you stop pouring into a cup with a hole at the bottom. You stop trying to convince someone who cannot see beyond their own limitations. And you stop betraying yourself in the name of staying. People only see your worth when you disappear because disappearance reveals what presence hid. Presence made it easy for them to pretend you didn't matter. Absence forces them to confront the truth. But the most important transformation isn't what happens to them, it's what happens to you. When you step away, your clarity returns. Your self-respect rises. Your emotional equilibrium renews. And your energy shifts back to where it always belonged, yourself. This is the beginning of a new version of you, one that no longer chases, no longer begs, no longer waits for someone to wake up. A version that stands tall in silence, certain of its own worth without needing validation from anyone else. This is where your story of strength begins. Not when they finally see your value, but when you finally stop giving it away. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below a moment in your life when stepping away made someone finally realize your worth. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who need it. There comes a point in every connection, whether romantic, emotional, or even just situational, where you begin to sense that your effort is no longer being met. You feel it in the subtle ways: the shorter replies, the declining enthusiasm, the delayed attention, the excuses that never existed before. You notice how you now carry most of the conversation, how you're the one pushing the bond forward, how you're the foundation holding together something that should be built by two. And though you try to ignore it, your intuition whispers the truth. You're giving more than the other person knows how to receive. When you stay too long in this dynamic, you begin to lose parts of yourself you didn't even realize were slipping away. You compromise pieces of your value just to remain relevant to someone who doesn't see you clearly. You silence your needs to avoid sounding too much. You tolerate emotional crumbs because you hope they'll eventually appreciate the feast you're offering. But this form of self-abandonment always ends in the same place: exhaustion. Not the physical kind, but the emotional fatigue that comes from being present for someone who treats you like a background character. This imbalance creates a dangerous illusion. The other person becomes convinced that no matter how little they give, you will always stay. That no matter how they behave, you will always forgive. That no matter how they treat you, you will always return. And because they mistake your loyalty for dependency, they slowly stop valuing the very presence that once benefited their life. They start to believe that losing you is impossible. This is where the damage begins. But the moment you decide to disappear, the illusion shatters instantly. Disappearing breaks every assumption they quietly built about you. It dismantles the comfort they felt in your predictability. It interrupts the cycle of neglect they thought you would tolerate forever. And when your presence vanishes, the mind of the other person is forced into a confrontation with reality. A confrontation they were not emotionally prepared for. Suddenly, they feel the silence where your voice used to be. They feel the emptiness where your attention used to rest. They feel the absence of someone who cared in ways they took for granted. The human mind reacts strongly to loss, especially when the loss was unexpected. Psychologists call this value recognition through deprivation. In simple terms, people recognize the value of something only after it is gone. While you were there, they underestimated you. Now that you're gone, they can't stop noticing the space you once filled. But disappearing isn't about punishing them, it's about healing you. The first thing disappearing gives you is emotional space. Without the constant cycle of giving and hoping, you finally have room to breathe. Your thoughts become clearer. Your feelings become lighter. You begin noticing the weight you carried, not because someone forced it on you, but because you offered far more than was ever reciprocated. This emotional space is what helps you rebuild your identity outside of the relationship. You start reclaiming the parts of yourself you had been sacrificing. The second gift disappearance offers is perspective. Distance allows you to see the truth without the fog of attachment. You begin recognizing how often you overlooked disrespect, how much you excused inconsistency, how many times you justified behavior that drained your emotional energy. This clarity hurts at first, but it is the kind of pain that cleans rather than wounds. It opens your eyes to the imbalance you normalized simply because you cared too much. The third transformation is a shift in self-worth. When you stop chasing someone who doesn't value you, your sense of dignity begins to repair itself. You start to remember what you deserve. You start to realize that your loyalty is a privilege, not a default setting. You begin to respect your own presence again. And this internal respect creates a quiet but powerful shift. You no longer tolerate what dims your spirit. Your standards rise, not because you want revenge, but because you finally understand the cost of lowering them. Meanwhile, something else begins to happen on the other side. The emotional imbalance they once relied on begins to collapse. The comfort they felt begins to fade. They notice that the world does not offer many people like you. They notice that the attention from strangers does not replace the attention you gave. They notice that superficial interactions cannot match the depth you brought into their life. And they notice that the line between not caring enough and losing forever is painfully thin. Your disappearance forces them to face a truth they were not ready to accept. You were significant. You were rare. You were irreplaceable. But here is the twist. By the time they understand this, you're no longer waiting for recognition. You're no longer craving validation. You're no longer anchored to the version of yourself that needed their approval. Your disappearance didn't just change their perception, it changed you. And that change is the real victory. Because when you disappear, you don't simply remove yourself from someone's life. You remove yourself from their ability to damage you. You step out of the cycle of being undervalued. You choose peace over pain, clarity over chaos, dignity over desperation. This is why disappearing is so powerful. Not because of what it does to them, but because of what it awakens in you. One of the most striking things that happens after you disappear is how the dynamic between you and the other person changes even without a single word being exchanged. Distance forces truth out of hiding. Silence becomes a mirror. And absence exposes everything that presence once concealed. It's almost unsettling how many things come to the surface the moment you step away. Things you couldn't see clearly while you were still emotionally involved. The first shift appears in the way the other person reacts to your absence. People who once replied slowly begin to check if you're online. People who dismissed your presence suddenly notice your silence. People who took your attention for granted now become strangely alert to anything you do, or don't do. It's not that they suddenly changed. It's that your absence interrupted the comfort they built around your presence. You broke a pattern they believed was permanent. And the human mind hates losing what it assumed it would always have. This is where the subtle signs start to show. The first sign is indirect reapproach. It usually begins with something small, a meaningless message, a random emoji, a distant question that doesn't actually require an answer. It's never a sincere apology or a direct admission of wrongdoing. Instead, it's a way to test if the door is still open. They want to confirm whether your disappearance is real or whether you're still waiting quietly in the background. They're not reaching out because of love. They're reaching out because losing control over you creates discomfort. The second sign is silent monitoring. They may not speak to you, but they watch you. They check your posts. They notice your activity. They observe any sign that you might have moved on emotionally. It's ironic. When you were present, they barely noticed you. Now that you're gone, they can't stop looking. This shift is not about affection. It's about fear. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of realizing that someone who was once available is no longer within reach. The third sign is performative happiness. This is when they begin posting exaggerated content, trying to appear unbothered or thriving. Loud laughter, sudden adventures, dramatic selfies. None of it is authentic. It's a show meant for you to see. They want you to believe they're unaffected by your absence, even though their sudden change in behavior reveals the opposite. Real happiness doesn't need an audience, but insecurity does. Then comes the most revealing sign of all, the silent confusion. This is when they don't reach out, don't provoke, don't display anything obvious. They simply disappear into their own thoughts. The reason is simple. Your absence triggered an emotional dissonance they weren't prepared for. They expected you to stay even after being undervalued. They expected you to keep trying. They expected you to carry the emotional weight as always. When you stopped, their internal narrative collapsed. And suddenly they are left with a question they never wanted to confront. Why did you stop trying? And that question begins to haunt them. Meanwhile, something even more important is happening within you. Disappearing gives you a new vantage point, a way to see things from above instead of from within. And from this distance, patterns that were once invisible begin to reveal themselves with brutal clarity. You begin to understand how often you were the one initiating contact, how often you softened conflicts, how often you excused behavior that hurt you, how often you defended someone who wouldn't do the same for you. This clarity is not meant to make you bitter. It's meant to make you aware. For the first time, you see the imbalance not as a flaw in yourself, but as a mismatch in emotional maturity. You see that the connection never lacked effort, it lacked reciprocity. Never lacked sincerity, it lacked responsibility. Never lacked care, it lacked depth. This understanding marks the beginning of a powerful shift. You stop internalizing someone else's inability to value you as a reflection of your worth. Instead, you see it as a reflection of their limitations. And once that truth settles in, something beautiful begins to grow inside you. Self-respect. Real, quiet, unshakable self-respect. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It simply stands firm. It whispers things your past self needed to hear. You didn't lose them. They lost access to you. You weren't the problem. You were the blessing. You didn't walk away too soon. You stayed far longer than you should have. This kind of clarity restructures your emotional landscape. You begin to understand that affection without effort is empty. That presence without appreciation is worthless. That attention without consistency is manipulation. You learn to differentiate between someone who likes you when it's convenient and someone who values you consistently. And as this new awareness grows, so does your strength. You become more grounded, more selective, more protective of your energy. Not because you're guarded, but because you've finally seen what giving too much to the wrong person does to your spirit. Your absence forces them to reflect, but it forces you to evolve. And in this evolution, you discover a truth that the old you couldn't see. You were never asking for too much. You were simply asking the wrong person. Your disappearance didn't break the connection. It revealed it. It exposed what was real and what was imagined. It showed you what is yours to carry, and what never was. This part of the journey is not about revenge or regret. It's about awakening. It's about coming back to yourself after being stretched thin. It's about recognizing your own emotional value without needing anyone to confirm it. And that realization becomes the turning point. As the days pass and your distance becomes consistent, something profound begins to happen inside you. At first, disappearing feels like an act of survival, a necessary escape from emotional imbalance. But over time, it becomes much more than that. It becomes a process of rebuilding, a journey of reclaiming parts of yourself you didn't even know you had lost. You start to realize that the transformation occurring within you is far more meaningful than anything happening on the other side. The first layer of this transformation is emotional clarity. When you were entangled in the situation, your mind was clouded by hope, fear, expectation, and confusion. You kept trying to interpret mixed signals, trying to read between the lines, trying to hold together something that was slowly slipping away. But once you step back, the fog lifts. You begin to see the reality of the situation with a sharpness you didn't have before. You recognize how much energy you poured into an emotional space that never poured back into you. You see clearly the imbalance you tolerated not because you were weak, but because you cared. With this clarity comes a second, deeper realization. You were losing yourself in the process of trying to be valued by someone else. You adjusted your tone, softened your boundaries, suppressed your needs, and questioned your worth. Not because you were flawed, but because you wanted to maintain a connection that was draining you. This is the kind of self-sacrifice that doesn't look like sacrifice until you step away and observe it from a distance. Only then do you understand how much of yourself you were giving up just to remain in someone's life. Distance reveals truth, but it also reveals wounds. And in recognizing these wounds, you open the door to healing. Healing begins quietly. It does not announce itself. It starts with small realizations. Realizations like, I deserve consistency. I deserve respect. I deserve someone who sees me without needing to lose me first. These truths begin to reshape your self-perception. You stop looking at yourself through the eyes of someone who undervalued you. You begin to see yourself as you truly are. Someone capable of deep love, profound loyalty, and genuine presence. These qualities are rare, and you start to understand that giving them to the wrong person was never a sign of weakness, it was a sign of excess strength. As your inner world rebuilds, so does your external behavior. You become more selective, not because you're bitter, but because you're awakened. You stop giving immediate access to people who haven't earned it. You stop tolerating half efforts and half attention. You stop accepting emotional crumbs. Not out of arrogance, but out of self-respect. You've lived the consequences of overextending yourself, and now your boundaries naturally rise to protect the version of you that is emerging. Meanwhile, from the other side, your distance begins to hit harder. They start to feel the shift. The silence they once ignored becomes heavier. The absence they once dismissed begins to echo. They realize that your energy, once steady, patient, and abundant, is no longer available to them. And the contrast becomes unbearable. It's a strange irony. The attention they once took for granted now feels like something precious that slipped through their fingers. But this realization arrives too late, because something fundamental has changed. You are no longer the person who once begged to be understood. You are no longer the person who tried to prove your worth. You are no longer the person who stayed even when staying hurt. That version of you dissolved the moment you chose to walk away. And the version that replaced it is stronger, wiser, and much harder to reach. As this internal transformation deepens, you also begin to notice how silence changes your emotional priorities. You start paying attention to your own needs. You start nurturing your own goals, your own peace, your own mental space. You begin to invest in yourself with the same intensity you once invested in someone else. This is where the real shift occurs. You move from seeking external validation to cultivating internal fulfillment. You no longer depend on someone else to give meaning to your days. You no longer wait for their message to feel valued. You no longer rely on their attention to feel whole. This kind of independence is not loud, it's calm. It's a quiet realization that you were always enough, even when someone failed to see it. Your absence forces them into discomfort, but it leads you into evolution. And that evolution becomes the foundation of the new standard you set for yourself. The most powerful moment arrives when you realize this. Disappearing didn't just show them your worth, it showed you your own. You understand that your value doesn't decrease because someone failed to recognize it. And you stop taking their limitations personally. Their inability to value you was never a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of their emotional capacity. With this understanding, your heart becomes lighter. The emotional weight you carried begins to dissolve. The desire to be seen is replaced with the desire to be at peace. The longing to be chosen fades into the strength of choosing yourself. The pain turns into wisdom. And the past becomes a lesson rather than a cage. And while they may eventually return, seeking the version of you they once knew, what they find is someone transformed. Someone who refuses to shrink again. Someone who will never beg, chase, or compromise their dignity just to be acknowledged. They will finally notice your worth. But by then, you will no longer need them to. This is the gift of disappearing. It breaks illusions, transforms your identity, and leads you back to the place where your value was always meant to come from, within. As the silence stretches on, something remarkable happens inside you. Something that would have been impossible if you had stayed. You begin to recognize the difference between attachment and alignment. Attachment is what kept you holding on to someone who didn't reciprocate. Alignment is what leads you to people who meet you where you are. And disappearing is the bridge between these two realities. Pulls you out of a space where you were shrinking and places you on a path where you can expand again. One of the most powerful lessons that emerges during the stage is understanding that your absence has value. Not in the sense of punishment or revenge, but in the sense of clarity. When you were always present, your presence felt ordinary. When you walked away, it became noticeable, almost heavy. This isn't about ego, it's about awareness. It's about realizing how much you brought into a connection that the other person never truly recognized. Distance forces them to confront a truth they avoided. Life feels different without you. But the more surprising truth is how you begin to confront your own patterns. You start to see the ways you used to overextend yourself. You remember the nights you waited for messages that never came, the conversations where you gave depth and received emptiness, the loyalty you offered to someone who couldn't match it. And suddenly you understand that the problem was never your ability to love. It was where you chose to place that love. This is when self-respect starts to rebuild itself from the inside out. Not because you repeat affirmations or force confidence, but because the contrast between how you felt when you stayed and how you feel now is undeniable. Your mind begins to breathe again. Your emotions become lighter. You realize that the exhaustion you used to feel wasn't sadness, it was resistance. Resistance against your own intuition telling you to let go. Disappearing removed the resistance, and clarity took its place. The most interesting part is how your identity shifts. You begin to reconnect with interests and hobbies that had faded into the background while you were emotionally invested. You start to enjoy your own company again. You rediscover the simplicity of doing things for yourself instead of waiting for someone to reciprocate. This reconnection is subtle at first, but it grows steadily. And each small realization becomes a brick in the foundation of the new version of you. Meanwhile, Your absence begins to change the emotional atmosphere for the other person as well. They start feeling the silent consequences of their lack of appreciation. They begin to realize that they mistook your kindness for permanence. They assumed you didn't know how to walk away. They believed that your loyalty meant they could give you less and still keep you close. But your disappearance disrupts that narrative completely. It forces them to confront a truth that is uncomfortable. You were offering something rare. You were giving something meaningful. You were showing a type of presence they won't easily find again. This creates a psychological ripple effect inside them. First comes curiosity. Why did you go silent? Then comes doubt. Did they push you too far? Then comes insecurity. Did you find someone better? And eventually, whether they admit it or not, comes regret. Not always regret for losing you as a person, but regret for failing to recognize your value when it mattered. But what they don't realize is that while they are beginning to reflect, you are beginning to rise. This rise isn't dramatic or loud. It's quiet and grounded. It happens in the moments when you choose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, dignity over desperation. It happens when you stop checking your phone, when you stop replaying old conversations, when you stop wondering what they think. Your emotional energy shifts from outward to inward, and that shift transforms your entire outlook. This internal elevation is the true gift of disappearing. Because something inside you changes permanently. You no longer fear losing people. You fear losing yourself. And that change is irreversible. With this new mindset, your standards evolve naturally. Not because you're trying to prove anything, but because you finally understand the cost of lowering your standards. You recognize how damaging it was to give without receiving, to show up without being appreciated, to stay in situations that were slowly eroding your self-respect. This awareness creates a new emotional baseline, one that refuses to settle for less than reciprocity. It also transforms how you interpret behavior. You used to excuse distance. Now you recognize it as disinterest. You used to tolerate inconsistency. Now you see it as a lack of emotional capacity. You used to internalize rejection. Now you understand it as misalignment. Your heart becomes wiser, not colder. Your mind becomes clearer, not harsher. You don't stop caring. You just stop chasing. And this new version of you, the one shaped through silence, becomes someone that even the person who once underestimated you can't help but notice. Because while they remain stuck in the comfort of old patterns, you are evolving beyond them. The emotional gap between you and them grows wider, not because you pushed them away, but because you outgrew the space you once occupied. There comes a moment in this journey when you look back and realize something profound. You didn't lose anything by disappearing. You gained yourself. And from that point on, the idea of returning to someone who made you feel small becomes unthinkable. Not because of pride, but because of awareness. Not because of anger, but because of growth. You now understand that anyone who needs to lose you to value you is someone who can never be trusted with your heart. And that realization changes everything. As more time passes and the distance between you and the other person becomes something normal rather than new, you begin to notice that the silence you once feared turns into a space where you can finally breathe. It no longer feels like a punishment or an emptiness to be filled. Instead, it becomes a territory where your mind settles, your emotions quiet down, and your sense of self expands in ways that were impossible when you were busy trying to be noticed by someone who barely looked at you. What once felt like loss slowly transforms into a strange kind of relief, the kind that arrives when you stop forcing what was never meant to be held together by your effort alone. During this period, you begin to understand how heavy the situation had become while you were still inside it. Your days were shaped by uncertainty, waiting, wondering, adjusting, hoping for small gestures that rarely came. You didn't realize how much it drained you because you were too close to it, too emotionally involved to see the imbalance clearly. But now, with space, everything looks different. You see how often you ignored your intuition, how many times you silenced your discomfort, how naturally you let someone else set the emotional tone while you tried to adapt yourself to it. Distance doesn't create this clarity. It simply allows you to finally pay attention to what was there the whole time. This gradual shift changes the way you relate to your own thoughts. Before, your mind was always busy trying to decode someone else's behavior. Now it begins to look inward instead of outward. You realize that your peace never depended on them. It depended on your willingness to let go of what disturbed it. That understanding settles slowly, like a truth you weren't ready to accept until you stepped away. And once it settles, something important begins to happen. The desire to be acknowledged by that person starts fading. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but in a calm, steady way, almost as if your heart is teaching itself to stop insisting. At the same time, your emotional reactions begin to change in ways you don't fully notice at first. You find yourself less reactive to things that once would have shaken you. The insecurity that used to surface whenever they pulled away no longer appears, because there is no longer an expectation tying you to their behavior. You stop checking your phone. You stop waiting for explanations. You stop imagining what they might be thinking. The silence that once echoed now becomes background noise, something you register but no longer attach meaning to. This emotional shift isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming whole again. While you are experiencing this internal adaptation, the other person begins to feel the effects of your absence in a completely different way. It doesn't happen instantly. It takes time for them to notice what's missing. It usually starts as a small discomfort, something they can't quite name. A sense that something familiar isn't there anymore. At first, they assume the feeling will pass. But it doesn't. And the longer your silence continues, the more they start to recognize that what disappeared wasn't just your presence. It was the stability and emotional attention they quietly relied on, even if they never admitted it. But what they feel now no longer affects your direction. You have reached a stage where external validation doesn't influence your emotional state the way it once did. You begin to understand that walking away gave you back something far more valuable than any apology or explanation ever could: your power of choice. When you were attached, you reacted. Now, you decide. You no longer wait to be chosen. You choose what brings peace, what feels genuine, what respects your emotional boundaries. This newfound clarity begins to reorganize everything. You notice that the version of yourself who stayed too long no longer matches the person you are becoming. You naturally become more selective with whom you allow to come close. Not out of fear, but because your peace has become too valuable to be handed to someone who might mishandle it. You start to see red flags you once ignored. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. You stop offering your loyalty as if it were something without weight. This evolution is quiet, but powerful. It shapes how you walk, how you respond, how you protect your emotional energy. What's interesting is how natural the detachment becomes. You don't force yourself to move on. You simply outgrow the need to hold on. The emotional craving disappears on its own because your mind finally has room to breathe without the constant pressure of trying to understand someone who didn't offer clarity. You begin to see the entire situation as something that once made sense but no longer fits who you are becoming. And just like that, what once kept you awake at night becomes something you can observe without pain. This shift is the true turning point of disappearing. It shows you that the healing didn't come from the other person changing. It came from you changing your relationship with your own expectations. You no longer center your emotional world around someone who couldn't carry it. You no longer attach your value to someone's inability to appreciate it. You no longer hope that one day they will see what they failed to recognize. You accept that you were too much for the wrong person and exactly enough for someone who hasn't arrived yet. And as this realization deepens, the person who once underestimated you begins to feel the full weight of what they lost. They begin to understand the difference between presence and attention, between affection and effort, between being wanted and being valued. But by the time this truth reaches them, you are already in a place where their recognition no longer matters. What mattered was the journey you took back to yourself. Your disappearance didn't weaken you. It reshaped you. And it did so in a way that ensures you will never again shrink yourself just to be seen. Reaching the end of this journey, you begin to understand that disappearing was never about proving anything to the other person. It was never about forcing regret or triggering panic. It was never about making them chase you or realize what they lost. Those things may happen, often do happen, but they are only side effects. The real purpose of stepping away wasn't to be seen by them. It was to finally see yourself with clarity. There comes a moment in this process when you look back and no longer recognize the version of yourself who begged for attention, who waited for replies, who accepted the bare minimum because they feared losing someone who was never truly present. Distance makes the truth visible. You weren't afraid of losing them. You were afraid of being alone with yourself. And now, strangely, That solitude feels like freedom. It feels like a return to the person you were before you tangled your worth with someone else's indifference. As the emotional dust settles, life starts rearranging itself around your new sense of self-respect. You begin to notice that your days are lighter. Your thoughts are clearer. The heaviness that once lived inside your chest dissolves, slowly and quietly, like a storm finally breaking after months of tension. You wake up without the tension of waiting, without the pressure of performing emotional labor for someone who never reciprocated it. And in this simplicity, you finally feel peace, the kind of peace you didn't even realize was missing. You also begin to see the past with a different kind of understanding. Instead of replaying conversations, instead of blaming yourself, instead of wishing you had done something differently, you start to recognize your own sincerity. You remember how deeply you cared, how hard you tried, how much of yourself you offered. And instead of feeling foolish for it, you begin to feel proud. Your effort was never the problem. Your heart wasn't the mistake. The mistake was allowing someone else's emotional limitations to define what you thought you deserved. What once felt like rejection now feels like redirection. You begin to understand that the ending wasn't a failure, it was an escape. It was the universe pulling you away from a place where you were shrinking, a place where your kindness was overlooked, a place where your presence was mistaken for something ordinary. But nothing about you is ordinary. And disappearing became the bridge between the life you were settling for and the life you were meant to build. As time goes on, you begin to understand something even deeper. Not every person who loses you deserves a second chance to find you again. Some people only wake up when it's too late. Some only recognize the value of what they had when it no longer belongs to them. Some only learn to appreciate the light when they are forced to sit alone in the dark they created. But their realization does not obligate you to return. Growth is not a circle, it is a path. And you are not meant to walk backwards. Eventually, the person who didn't see your worth will confront the consequences of their choices. They will feel the weight of your silence. They will understand what your presence meant. They will remember your loyalty, your empathy, your patience. They will realize that the connection they treated so carelessly was one they may never find again. And when that realization hits, it will be sharp, unsettling, undeniable. But by then, your heart will be anchored somewhere else, in a place built from truth rather than illusion. You won't hate them. You won't resent them. You simply won't be available anymore. Not because you became cold, but because you evolved. Not because you lack compassion, but because you finally learned compassion for yourself. And that shift is final. It cannot be undone. The moment you choose yourself after choosing others for so long, the entire way you move through the world changes. You no longer accept uncertainty packaged as connection. You no longer tolerate inconsistency disguised as affection. You no longer shrink your worth to fit inside the limits of someone else's emotional capacity. Disappearing didn't break you. It rebuilt you. It took you out of the shadows of someone else's indecision and placed you back into the center of your own life. It allowed you to detach from a story that was hurting you and step into one that aligns with your dignity. And now, standing at the end of this process, you can see clearly why everything unfolded the way it did. If they had valued you earlier, you might have stayed. If they had appreciated you sooner, you might have settled. If they had given you just enough attention, you might have continued shrinking yourself to fit inside their world. The loss they feel now is the freedom you gained. The emptiness they confront is the peace that returned to your life. The regret they carry is the clarity that awakened inside you. This is what disappearing truly accomplishes. It opens your eyes, strengthens your heart, elevates your standards, and brings you back to yourself in a way nothing else could. And now, you're ready for the next chapter. One where your worth is not invisible, where your effort is not drained, and where your presence is recognized without needing to vanish first. If someone must lose you to realize your value, they were never meant to keep you. If this message resonated with you, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below the biggest insight you're taking with you today. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who need this reminder.